Hello, welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 17, Understanding and Judgment. It's an investigation into honesty and integrity as to pertains to truth. We talked briefly last week in episode 16 about emotional attachments to ideas, desire and frailty. We talked a little bit about David Hume. We talked a little bit about treatise on human nature, the idea of the passions, and the idea of kind of like what what pertains to truth. I talked basically about the idea that we made a differentiation between honesty and truth, and I kind of think that kind of like was a beginning. And then we're going to kind of talk about this in relations as it relates to authority. As our authority is something we had spoken about. So anyway, this is a series of ruminations regarding my investigations to architecture and general basic understanding of principles as I see them as I've gone through various different things. Um, so we started off with investigations into the metaphor. We talked about how that was a process that I kind of investigated, started thinking about it when I was in college as a student, and then kind of continued it as a professor, and then considered it after that in my own individual research. Then we talked about how it, kind of existed in certain circumstances, talked about it as a kind of existing thing, as an aesthetic thing. And then we also had talked about how it was actually more an organic, natural process that we kind of I associated with things like entanglement and things like that, and how that it kind of we like a lot of things we think that we invented these things as intellectual things, but we basically just came to understand them. So there's always that kind of thing that goes back and forth. It's a kind of fun thing that I see a lot of times with my mathematician friends talking about the ideas like, did we discover this or did we invent it? Like real numbers and imaginary numbers and certain things that they find. It's like, were these things always here? We simply discovered them, or did we need them? And I think like one of the fun questions is in terms of imaginary numbers, that looks like something that we kind of made it up. It was useful to us, and kind of found something that kind of allowed us to make certain kind of determinations. But on the other hand, like prime numbers were something that we kind of discovered. It was kind of there, or like pi. Anyway, this is a kind of much broader conversation, but it was a fun thing to talk about. What's interesting was I'd started these talks a while ago on another platform, and that platform basically collapsed on me. And I found that it was something that I couldn't sustain. So as a result, I kind of like moved over to here, and and on YouTube. It looks like these things are more likely to be here for a while. So my feeling also is the fact that like as a result of this, I'm going to probably use these things, kind of make transcripts or kind of other things and kind of put them in other forms. But it's useful for me to kind of put them in the form of a series of kind of like investigations, or at least talking about them. Because I mean, as I've talked about them, certain things, especially one of the things I talked about last week, came to kind of like greater fruition in terms of like how I kind of formulated it. So anyway, as an architect, researcher, draftsman, um, speculist, imagineer, these are words that we've kind of invented, Julie and I, in the Art Science Complex. Also want to say hello to my friends Warren at Create Matter. He's a colleague now, and has been a colleague for a while. But there's some of our content over on his page, as well as we want to get some of I've done an interview on him over on this page. But as we go forward, there's probably going to be a much more of a kind of cross pollination. And Warren is an incredibly provocative guy. He has this incredible ability to ask questions, which is, I think, a very valuable thing. And I think, when we talk about that, there's an unbreakable bond. We talked about the one between, what was it? I think it was sarcasm and tolerance. And I think questioning and tolerance is also a really good unbreakable bond, because I think that the inability to be tolerant of questioning is, I think, a form that one has to be suspicious of. Anyone who is somewhat defensive or kind of looks to hide from questions has to be looked upon as somewhat suspect in my view. So gonna like say that Warren basically is the uh, the questioner. He's the inquisitor, and he really does do an excellent job of kind of getting people to. Let me write that down. It's a good note to basically question and tolerance. There's a great degree of intolerance in the world today, and I think that's an indictment of, of our society. We benefit from criticism and dialogue. When we run from criticism and dialogue, we basically do ourselves a disservice because it has been probably the preeminent indicator of clarification in terms of exchange of ideas. So one of the things is in the realm of ideas, for it to be free to all, you basically want to have as much social liberty as possible in order to engage the freedom of ideas as much as possible. The freedom of ideas is the kind of thing that will become incredibly overwhelming because it kind of, given the imagination and curiosity of the individual, it can go very deeply. And you want to have as much liberty as possible, meaning granted that by society, in order to investigate this to the deepest levels. This to me is kind of like undeniably clear. I mean, almost like the fact that it's kind of hard to imagine people would be arguing for otherwise. But I think the question is, they're not arguing for otherwise because I think they know that an argument for such would be absurd. They're basically just kind of lobbying for it, which is a different thing, is that they want to make it the case rather than actually kind of like want to investigate it as an idea. All right, so understanding and judgment. Now, like I said, we spoke last week about emotional attachments to ideas, and I think the question is, we are always moving, as Hume says, from the passions. The passions are the things that we use, so that reason and the passions basically are linked in the fact that they form an unbreakable bond, but the passions lead the discussion. The impulses, the desires, these are the things that move. I mean, as much as I love Star Trek, the classic Star Trek, they always said like logic was what saved the Vulcans. You don't begin from logic. You don't begin from reason. It tempers your passions. So maybe, when they say that like that they were logical people, what they said was tempering their passions with logic is what allowed them to become a highly advanced and commendable, kind of like valuable kind of people. So anyway, as we talked about the fact that we talked about the honesty, dishonesty, and truth. Truth is or isn't a thing that exists. I don't think that it's possible to deny the fact that the idea of truth exists, like the idea of God, or like the idea of a universe, or like the idea of life or consciousness or whatever. If it exists, and to what degree it exists, and to what degree we can appreciate it or curtail it or understand it or kind of grasp it, that really is the discussion. And I think to say that it doesn't exist is just foolish. Because we basically aspire to the fact that, to a degree, regardless of if we can prove it or not, if we can find it or not, we find that there's utility in basic abilities to correlate information. So what I mean by that is, if I draw a map, if that map is intended to be a kind of like a description of a neighborhood or an area, it may allow me to kind of traverse around that area in order to kind of find things. But is it completely factual and it kind of pertains to all the information of the area? Probably not. But is it useful in terms of allowing me to kind of get things accomplished, to get to the drugstore, to get to the bank, to get to the grocery store, to get to the gym? Yes. So in terms of that, and like it's used and it has a utility. So in terms of the truth has a certain utility in terms of the ability to kind of discipline ourselves in terms of our information. So the truth may be that which we could ultimately know about something. Honesty, right, pertains to what we believe we understand. So the thing is, someone may have seen this, right? And what happens is they say, when I was looking at a cube, I saw what, well, I could say, I see a square. Let's see. I see a square with 9 orange subsquares. That's correct. Now, what I'm seeing, right, if I turn it around, I'm seeing that. And I'm seeing what looks like a cubic shape with 9 red, 9 green, and 9 yellow squares, right? But they may not be squares. Here, it looks pretty clear that they're squares. Here, it looks a little bit more distorted, right? Now, again, the person who's seeing this doesn't see what's back here. So basically, point of view became an important thing. Perspective became an important idea with Ortega Gasset. He talked about perspectivism. And I think point of view is something that also kind of pertains to like Whitehead in terms of the fact that you have the specific perspective point of view that you have. And I think, in the case of his theology, he believed that really if there was to be truth, it would have to be contained with all the particular perspectives in order to basically so all these simultaneous perspectives, right? In order to kind of have the totality of the cube. Because like I said, if I'm pointing this at the screen, this is like now a diamond shape of 9 white diamonds, right? But for me, I see a diamond shape of 9 yellow diamonds. Okay, so we honestly appraise what we think we see, what we think we perceive. Is this the truth? As we can see, the truth is much more complicated than that. This object, right? Now, if I make a few alterations to it, it becomes more complicated. The information becomes less, discernible. And then as we go, other things will take place. So there's this idea of judgment and this idea of understanding, but it kind of builds upon what we were talking about last week in terms of the difference between honesty, right, and the truth. So we give our honest appraisal in the fact that we're trying to pertain to certain things. Now, in the terms of the situation when we deceive ourselves, intentionally deceive ourselves or deceive others, we may not necessarily be able to kind of say that we won't be able to kind of like appreciate or kind of pertain to certain truth or parts of the truth, right? But the thing is, in this case, it's really not a pursuit. Doesn't mean it could happen accidentally, right? But it doesn't seem that that's basically, that idea. So in sense, what we try to do now is we try to kind of say as if like, there's a better chance or there's a benefit or maybe there's a value in kind of like honestly looking towards this thing called the truth. And we talked a little bit about what Hume said in the kind of last pieces of the Passions when he kind of talked specifically about the very specific and grand nature of the truth. And I kind of feel that, yes, there very much is a truth, but that basically comes from a desire to kind of like find what exactly that may indeed be. So now on to this. There is an understandable capacity. Now we kind of take this on faith, the fact that things can be understandable. In order to have these discussions, we have to make certain kind of leaps of faith. We don't know if anything we actually believe to be understanding is indeed understanding. That all could be washed away once we kind of find that like there are things that are maybe not understandable or maybe nothing is understood. It does seem to be a certain utility around this idea that we have discerned certain things. The fact that there are 9 squares on the face of that cube. Whatever value that is, I mean, at least it seems like it's something we could all pretty much agree upon or come to some kind of understanding of what that information pertains to. So the crisis comes, and some of these investigations that we've been talking about recently have been pertaining to this idea of societal health. Given the roadmap that's laid out by Whitehead in terms of how one moves towards civilization, which builds upon the thinkers of the Enlightenment, we come to the fact that I've indicated that there are certain kind of unbreakable bonds. Then unbreakable bonds are basically these assimilations of terms, concepts that are kind of like proto metaphors or kind of like social metaphors that basically stand to kind of allow us to kind of make progress. One of the ones we talked about early on was the one that pertains to technique and reason, or we could say science, right, and technology. That we can use science as opposed to superstition to basically test these objects that we have, that we kind of like hold in our hands. So that in case that we believed that by sacrificing virgins or making funny dances, we were capable of changing the weather, we've come to understand that there's no basis to believe such things. And now even the child would look upon those such things as silly. But there were times when lives were sacrificed, right? Tremendous savagery took place in order to kind of like lend credibility to these things that basically, had no basis in reality. People talk about how many witches were burned. The answer, of course, is zero. There were no such thing as witches. This was a kind of like fictitious idea. It may have been maliciously or nefariously generated. The reason for what's generation is kind of suspect, but at the same time, it did force a brutal and persecuted end to a lot of valuable individuals. Now, there is witchcraft that we kind of have people that study witchcraft, but in terms of what we perceived witchcraft to be, right, in terms of its ability to kind of make these kind of magical things, though that could conceivably be possible, it was not something that we had factually demonstrated existed. So, by taking the bond between technique and superstition and changing that and making the bond between technique and reason, we were now able to kind of be able to strengthen a lot of these things, these techniques, and advance them. When you look at the technological advances that have taken place since the Renaissance, in a mere 500 years, 600 years, it's kind of staggering. The fact that we went from where we were to the point where now we have the ability to kind of like move from this spinning orb in the universe to other spinning orbs in the universe, and maybe in 20 years we'll be able to kind of go to a new one. Listen to the idea of Elon Musk talking about the fact that maybe in 20, 30 years we'll be on Mars. But certainly, I lived when I was 10 years old. I saw a man walk on the moon that revolves around our planet. I thought, and this is one of the things we've also kind of indicated, because for me, there's a serious indictment of societal health in the fact that my life at 65 years old was supposed to be me jettisoning myself throughout deep space on my way to an infinite horizon. Basically, that I would pass into stardust from stardust. As Carl Sagan, said, we're all stardust and we come from stardust. And we basically, for me, the beauty of my dream as a 10-year-old boy is that in my old age, I would be jettisoned back into stardust, moving directly away from the point of origin from which I came, which to me was a beautiful, beautiful image. But as I walk through the MTA, through the subway, and I look at the kind of like disaster of society, I look at, not only did we not realize these objectives of the 1960s, but we failed ourselves miserably, and it's embarrassing and it's pitiful and it's pathetic. And we first have to put the blame on those we chose to lead us because they betrayed us. I mean, the dreams of John F. Kennedy in the Rice University speech was just an absolute brilliant rendition of the horizon of dreams being grander than it had ever been in any time in civilization. Now, was it inclusive to all people or to even all Americans? No. there were prejudice, there were problems, there were issues, but for the realm of ideas, for the horizon of ideas, for those few, it was certainly greater than it had ever been before. And by greater, I meant, whereas opposed to, like, there were certain kings who had certain potentials for certain power, which were kind of a handful of people. And not only was the things that in these past times were these kings capable of doing eclipsed by a dramatic degree to what was now pretty much with a much greater population of, say, even the common man. The idea that Neil Armstrong was a kind of like guy who kind of was a person not from the royalty, not from the bourgeois, but a man who just basically came from the people. And he basically turned out to be the best and the brightest and the most capable. And he had the tremendous opportunity and privilege of being the first person to set foot on a planet other than the one that we live on. It was beautiful. It was fantastic. And it was the kind of thing that made a 10-year-old kid from Queens dream as if there was no horizon to dreams. So like I said, my ambition was one day I would close my eyes for the last time and my body and my craft would disintegrate into the stardust from which it came. And there were other people like me, other men and women by that time, who would basically take that same flight. I spent the first 30 years of my life waiting to be annihilated in a nuclear explosion. So the same technology, the same science that could send rocket ships to the horizon and beyond, were now used basically to create this imaginary button that we decided, hey man, we have this ability to press this button and basically annihilate almost everything we know. But let's try not to touch it. But we had created it. So we had taken those ambitions of rocket ships and spaceships and, kind of like the efficiency and the kind of idea of horizons of dreams, and we had turned them back on ourselves and pointed themselves as weapons. I was hearing an analogy made between Elon Musk and Adolf Hitler in terms of rocket ships. And I said, well, the one major difference in terms of making this analogy is that, and they said, well, Hitler wanted to have electric cars. So there's a similarity in the fact that him and Hitler both wanted electric cars and rocket ships. And I said, yes, but how many rocket ships has Elon Musk ever fired at anyone? Which was clearly Hitler's ambition. Every rocket ship he has, he basically aimed at innocent civilians or civilians, right? Elon Musk has never, ever raised his hand in anger with the weapons, right, that could be potentially sown from his inventions. In fact, recently, the only two people he targeted were the two people he rescued who had been stranded by NASA, who had once put a man on the moon. NASA now, because of the lack of ambition and the lack of vision by our government, cannot even return to the place it had been in 1969. So I was ready to go to Horizon. And so many other people were willing to go with me side by side in that great adventure. Moon bases and starships and star bases and Mars colonies and Venus colonies and colonies throughout the solar system. And then from there, who knows what's to be next? The expansion and the kind of growth in this shining kind of like idea of people who basically followed their dreams in science, in art, in technology, in music, in every part of culture. Look what we have. It's embarrassing. It's pathetic. It's an embarrassment. It's something we should pity ourselves for. Now, again, are we all to blame? Some of us are to blame. Certainly anybody who was a president of the United States after JFK can certainly be to blame. Now, individuals are starting to embrace those things that nations with ambition and vision would care about. That they would basically say, we need to go to the stars. Now, there was a group of people after the Civil War, men with rifles. And in fact, if you look at some of the early science fiction movies, the propulsion systems of rockets were like bullets. We fire a bullet at the moon. And you can see that that was actually the way in which these people who would basically kind of come after this, incredible emancipation of humanity, when America came to understand, hey, man, you can't own people as property, right? America came to understand that this is wrong. This can't be. And we have to stop this. Now, was that the understanding of all people who wanted to do it? Were some people kind of looking for nefarious ways to keep it or nefarious ways to create it? Of course. But we came to understand, and I think that there's a correlation between uh, Charles Darwin writing The Origin of Species and people understanding the fact that indeed the people who are my brothers, right, are indeed those people who I descend from. So in the fact that like I descend from apes, all humans are basically descendant of the same groups. Now it wasn't necessarily apes, but it basically came from stardust. The stardust basically accreted, the principles kind of came, one thing came to another. We came to amino acids, we came to kind of like to kind of like organisms expanded, they became more complex. So we see, as we talked about before, the fact that complexity comes from entanglement, and that over these courses, but for whatever reason, this takes place and we come to greater complexity, greater sophistication from simplicity. So in that, we get to our point, understanding and judgment. By coming to understanding basically is that part that tempers the passions, as if we could say it's similar to that idea of of the passions, right, and the techniques and reason and logic, science, so that our passions now can be understood and appreciated and seen as correlating directly to these desires that we have. That we can say, I can test this and I can come to this, but I can also question its merit. I think I haven't talked about it, but we will eventually talk about the idea of what I call natural morality or the morality of nature, because as pertains to the good or bad or kind of like uh, what is right or wrong, nature makes it very clear. If you persist in a way that is consequential, you don't become part of the fossil record. If you don't, that's your goal. So, in terms of persistence, I think there's a very clear relationship between persistence and, kind of like extinction. So, in that case, I mean, morality, what is good and what is bad, pertains to what persists. Now, in each species, in each organization, it's different. Kind of like the fact that in our country, in the United States, we have this correlation between a federal government, state government, a city government, all basically pertaining to interpretations of the Constitution. So basically, Oregon and Utah and the federal government will pertain to different portions of what makes sense for them, given their understanding and their interpretation of these things. So for a wasp, for a dolphin, for Homo sapien, right? The ideas are the same. They're just instituted through the difference of context. As Ortega says, I am myself, my circumstances. I have to understand my destiny. That is a specific organizational construct, in which case I exist. And to ignore that, I do at my own risk. So what happens is we make judgments. We make judgments in order to kind of like better serve ourselves in terms of better understanding what we do. But here's the problem. I think it's very easy, just like free speech, it's very easy, right? We've kind of missed the kind of value of it. We find people who make judgments with no authority. Their judgment is basically intended to just feel as if I feel completely free to judge something I have absolutely no understanding of. And this is a problem. This is basically an indictment. Because what happens is, as we talked about before, and we go back to that story of how I kind of played a trick on my students and my colleagues and pretended to be a student in order to kind of say, as a student, what I say has a different relevance than what I say if I'm a professor or I'm a researcher or I'm a dean or whatever. But the reality was that is not as true as we think, that the authority of the argument come from the compelling nature of its conclusions, not from the argument of authority for itself. Because the thing is, if indeed one is capable of being in a position of authority, it's expected that they can make a compelling argument. So when someone says, oh, well, I'm an economist, and therefore, as a result, I'm the only one who can speak about this. It's okay. So speak about this in a way that you make your principles clear. As Richard Feynman said, if you can't explain it, it's because you really don't know it very well. Now, you still may know better than me, but you may not know it as well as you think you do, which kind of goes back to the idea of Warren and the idea of the question and tolerance of the question. How well do you tolerate being questioned? How well do you take sarcasm? How well do you take humor? I saw something on the on YouTube the other day, and it's really funny because a couple of years ago when I gave the first go round of these things were not political ideas. These were not things in the public eye. They were just kind of constructs and way in which I proceeded in terms of my understanding of my work and how to proceed in terms of the way I kind of like see things. But it's incredible how much there's been an onslaught on a lot of these things. I always thought these things were kind of, like I said, they were self-explanatory. They were kind of clear. But the idea of having, criticism, I did always see that as problematic because I realized even then, when I was a boy, when I was a student, criticism was something that was already under siege, even in places where it was the lifeblood of the institutions. Because if I can't be direct and make the point, as I said, there's a difference between saying what someone wants to hear and saying what needs to be said. And as I said, I think one of the greatest, not only greatest ways in which someone can pay respect to someone, but one of the most valuable things one can do is basically say what needs to be heard. This is something that as a critic, I kind of set my time and effort towards, is basically looking at an object, looking at that which was under investigation, and basically saying, this is what I believe to be the most consequential thing that I can say at this moment pertaining to this. This is an incredibly high standard, but I mean, that's ultimately what we do if we want to benefit from the circumstances we've created for each other. Right? If we want to basically kind of discern these things, the value of consequence is something that we have to work at. So what happens is now I kind of see these things where people say like, oh, I think that's stupid, or I don't see why. And again, that's fine. Just like one can say whatever one wants, and that's a great opportunity. That's not the reason we have it. We don't have freedom of speech, so people can say nonsensical gibberish. That's just the result of the fact that we need that social liberty in order to emancipate our freedom of our ideas to their greatest extent. So in emancipating the nature of our ideas to the greatest extent, we want to open up that social liberty of expression as far and as wide as possible. So we have to tolerate the nonsense, which is fine. But what happens is part of that nonsense is unsubstantiated statements that are basically pertaining to be judgmental, as if somehow those had some consequence. So what happens is we have to kind of understand that judgment has to be linked to some kind of an authority. And the authority comes not from the position that one pertains to, but the ability of the authority that you have accrued over time that allows you to gain a perspective that makes it likely that you're going to make a compelling statement. That isn't given. It's just because someone is in a position of authority in terms of social authority doesn't mean that individual is capable of a statement of consequence pertaining to the issue under investigation. So in that case, I think what we have to understand is this is similar to what we were talking about in terms of the fact that it is possible that one can because of their authority, social authority, that a social authority may have actually been, as it used to be, or at least I kind of remember it to be, more gained as a result of the authority came from consequence, right? That you were the person who was most likely to be able to make a statement of value. Now, I've seen students and we've seen situations where people have a maturity beyond their age and are capable of making contributions well in advance of when that was expected. Age is not a delineator. It neither kind of grants it access or denies it. There have been people who won Nobel Prizes for physics in their 20s. There have been people who kind of like were teaching kind of advanced technical classes in logic and mathematics at Ivy League institutions and places like MIT in their teens, right? I mean, there are people who have obtained their PhDs, right, in years barely removed from childhood. So it's the question is this person capable of understanding and appreciating the work in a deep enough way that it can be made and illustrated to other people? I mean, I remember my own case was the case when I was a kind of professor, and I was a professor at a fairly young age, and in fact, like often, felt as if like there were plenty of my students who were older than me, but I never saw them as older than me. I saw them as actually quite young because I didn't see biological age as a definer of anything. I saw mastery as a definer of things. So I saw my colleagues as the people who were at the same level of mastery as me. And I've always seen that. And what's interesting is that as I go through my life at 65 years old, my friends range in age anywhere from like 16 to 100. And, it's very common to have a kind of like for me to have a discussion group with like, a 19-year-old, a 40-year-old, and myself and an 85-year-old. I mean, in fact, one of the things I always loved about origami was that like that's a great place where you really see genius, and you'll have kind of like you'll have people who basically are all just kind of brought there by their parents. Now, their parents could basically be their caretaker, or there could be their mother or whatever. But it was like I always really thought it was funny that we would sit around, and I remember the group that we had, and one was a retired physics professor, and myself, and then a few kind of like one I think was Jonathan. I think was 10 years old, and let's see, there was a few other. In fact, like and they were just we understood the principles of which the investigations were taking place. So, in terms of judgment, right? If one makes a judgment, one should be able to substantiate the nature of that judgment. And what I mean by that is to basically say, how did you come to this conclusion? Walk this conclusion past me so you can illustrate the principles by which you came to it. And this is something that people basically, will either be eager to do, and those are the people you should kind of look to engage and have as colleagues. And then there's the people who basically kind of like will, kind of move away or try to distract. And I see too much of this. And I think, I don't think social media is the cause, but social media certainly is the place in which it can be demonstrated. And I think that right now in our kind of particular climate, there's a tremendous amount of bad faith. And I find this kind of quite sad. To me, it's very, very, very saddening, because I feel as if it's a disingenuous kind of desire to kind of like place one in a position of power without having earned it. And I think that there's too many forces that aspire to authority but don't actually achieve it. So I think we have to be wise in terms of the people that we listen to, but we also have to be like Warren. We have to question. I mean, Carl Sagan was always kind of like talked about skepticism. My mentor, David Hume, and I never met the man, but I think I would really liked him. Supposedly he was a really likable person, and he loved engaging in kind of like thoughtful discussion. But anyway, he was the master of skepticism. He basically the project of skepticism never came into a greater fruition than was in that case. So as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I believe that you know that idea of criticism and skepticism are kind of like an unbreakable bond, and if we ever lose that, we kind of do ourselves a tremendous inservice and will be very much in danger. So anyway, hopefully we understand the fact that, like, judgment is very, very necessary. It's the kind of thing that allows us to kind of basically move from a position we're at to a deeper, more sophisticated position. But we have to be incredibly skeptical of the value of judgment at this point, because there is so much judgment in bad faith. And I feel as if, like, that's because the situation is there should be this unbreakable bond between understanding and judgment, that the judgment comes from the understanding, and that the authority of the judgment it is illustrated through that understanding. So that in that understanding of what is under discussion, what is under scrutiny, right? That judgment basically shows there is a perspective by which we have found something that we did not previously have, and it's of consequence. So in that case, I think that's really kind of quite clear as to how that works. So, this is kind of something that kind of like will go back to what we talked about in terms of unbreakable bonds, and that's what we're going to be talking about next week. Is what is an unbreakable bond? And we've kind of hinted it. We've used the term, and we've kind of illustrated some of them. But now we're going to go into, like, what is it and why is it valuable? It's my term. I don't think I've ever heard anyone use it other than me. But I mean, I think it's something that kind of certainly pertains to other ways and other investigations. For me, it's basically a societal metaphor. It's a societal metaphor that basically charts a path towards a progressive movement towards civility. Now, as we talked earlier, we talked about the fact that one of the differences, and we'll talk about this coming up, is the difference between tradition and culture. Now, tradition are a series of activities, techniques, demonstrations. And culture basically is an understanding of how those things become necessary for a group to kind of like see itself as having conditions on its persistence. Now, I kind of came up with this question this week, which I kind of like. See if I have it on I think I put it on my phone. This might be good. I should kind of put it in here. It's my investigation. Let's see. Wrote it to myself. Didn't want to forget it. And let's see. Let's see. Should be here, sir. Let's see. Let me type it in. Let me type my name in. We have an impulse to persist, but do we have an impulse to persist for its own sake, out of fear, possibly, or because it's desirable? Now, the desirability part is something that kind of exists in certain kind of things that we find in nature. For instance, like reproduction is kind of pleasurable experience, but it's also necessary. It helps us persist. So is there some kind of unconscious impulse towards persistence? Or is it in sometimes just desire? And if so, how did this correlation come upon us of the fact that that which is most necessary in terms of our imperative we have to be tricked into doing it, if that's the case? Or, as I see it, it's because we put conditions on existence, different than tradition. In the case of tradition, we do these things in order to survive. We don't question it. But in culture, we basically say there are things that we would not give up and still want to be. Now, we talked about the fact that in my life, my situation was such that I was expecting to spend very little time on this planet. And certainly by the time I was, my age now, which is 65, I'll be 66 in less than a month. basically the idea was I would have long since left this planet and kind of had it as a vague memory in the back of my mind. And I was a solo adventurer, kind of like, in this grand adventure. But that didn't happen. So, I feel as if I've been cheated, betrayed, and I believe it was because we basically failed to have the courage and the vision to manifest those things. But enough said about that. Those things show that there is a societal blockage, and it has to be understood in order to not continue to make these mistakes. We had the potential of our horizon, and we fell far and woefully below it. Doesn't have to be that way. But in terms of the fact that we kind of see these indicators, these things have consequence in order to be listened to. And we can distract ourselves, but we don't distract ourselves in any good way. We simply don't fulfill our destiny. Now, there's a difference between fulfilling destiny and making giant leaps, and there's a point where you don't continue to survive. So the idea is, like I said, the greatest kind of like invention, cultural invention, was suicide, because it's ultimately setting conditions on, I will not in this case. So whereas I was more than willing to kind of like expire and become stardust at the end of my life and give my substance back to the universe from which it came, I felt quite cheated that at 30 years old still, when I was in the Soviet Union, 1990, when I was my 30, a little over my 30th birthday, that I was trying not to be vaporized. But my point was, and I always felt like I had to make a decision. So Bruce, would you live, as some people had to decide? Would you build a bomb shelter? Would you stack that bomb shelter and kind of basically stay in it if there was a nuclear attack? Were you going to eat maggot-infested carcasses of dogs out of the street? No, not me. No. I have very much been conditional in the fact that if the things that pertain to beauty, love, and truth, that are our highest cultural achievements, continue to be threatened and are erased, I have no interest in being here. I have no interest in living in a time where there's no knowledge of Voltaire, and there's no interest and there's no ability to climb back to where we are now. I see ourselves falling miserably, and it's embarrassing. So as a result, I see myself in a situation where I think, persistence in a tribal, feral way has no interest to me. The attainment of beauty, truth, and love, however, makes me want to live for 1,000 lifetimes. And that's a choice. That's a choice we have to. I mean, this is my decision. Again, I remember, I think I heard someone say, I cannot tell you what's best for you, but I can tell you what I understand for me. And one of the things I've made a point of trying to do, and I think that's why these investigations, these talks, these ruminations are valuable to me, is it helps me clarify. In fact, what's interesting is I feel very, very happy because I wasn't really sure how this particular episode was going to go. But I feel as if I kind of clarified a lot of things for myself. And I'm gonna listen to this one a few times because I really am excited about it. Now, that's where we're going to close this one. I'm going to say something about episode 15. For some reason, was only taped for 15 minutes or 7 minutes or something like that. So I'm going to erase that one and I'm going to redo it before I kind of like have it get too far out of my mind, because that'll be the third time I've done that. So I did it once before it got erased, and then I'm doing it a second time, and then somehow it was just a tech glitch that probably was me messing up. And now I'm going to do it again. So I may do it tonight. I may do it tomorrow night. I'm not sure. Might do it tomorrow night. We'll see. But again, it's like I'll have to see where we go. But anyway, this was really good. I really enjoyed this. I feel as if like I kind of like put together a lot of things that kind of like had been maybe a little bit less constructed, and maybe hopefully, I kind of gave myself a little bit more of a reason to kind of like see the roadmap, gave myself a little bit of consequence and value in terms of the fact that the map that I'm making is kind of like gives me a little bit better understanding to go deeper. So next week we're going to talk about let's see. Today was what is understanding and judgment. So next is number 18, 30th of March, 2025. What is an unbreakable bond? So we'll go into detail about that, just as it pertains to the kind of like the consequence of the social metaphor, how it pertains to what we can use in terms of it being something that can give us a sense of understanding how we can check against our list of things in terms of our particular destiny and in terms of like building towards a societal progress. So that's going to be exciting. That kind of pulls together a lot of things. It'll pull things together from Ortega, from Whitehead, probably a little bit of other things from Hume, from Darwin. You know, I remember Whitehead in Aims of Education. He said, "Don't teach a lot of things. Teach a few things, but teach them from a lot of different perspectives." Let me see. The book's right here. Let me just pull it out. See if I can find it. This is my non-annotated one, so it's kind of a little bit. It's a little bit harder to find, but let's see. Yeah. It's like, oh my God, it's like I kind of memorized it almost. The result of teaching small parts of a large number of subjects is a passive reception of disconnected ideas, not illuminated with the spark of vitality. Let the main ideas which are introduced into a child's education be few and important, and let them be thrown into every possible combination. Fucking huge stuff. The fucking guy was fucking brilliant, bro. I mean, again, it's just so fucking obvious, right? Now, I mean, people might say it's common. That's not common sense. That's genius. There's a difference between genius and common sense. Common sense is wipe your feet, right? Genius is saying something that profound. I often say, like simple is not easy. Being able to kind of make a formulation like that takes a tremendous amount of genius, but it's not common. Is a singular individual can say something that profound. So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about what is an unbreakable bond, and that basically will be something that we kind of put in the landscape of how important it is to us. All right, so I'll do that for next week, and then we'll also basically redo number 15. So in closing, the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain it that way. Thank you.